Morning everybody, welcome to IndyCar on the 19th of June. My name is Gordon Ross, and on the news today, well, there's three items of news really that I think have caught my attention today. The first one is about the grandmother being barred from a chip shop in Oban because she was carrying a saltire flag, or was wrapped in a saltire flag. The second item of news is about the continuing, what would we call it, the kind of reverse Big Brother that's happening at the moment on the BBC with this so-called Your Next Prime Minister show that they've been running as a mini-series. And finally, we'll look at China, and we'll look at the news that the United Kingdom is using Huawei hardware components in its top-secret F-35 fighter aircraft. But first of all, let's talk about the grandmother from the march at Oban, who was recently refused admission to a local chip shop in Oban because the owner claimed that they didn't want any trouble. And later quizzed about this, the owner of the chip shop said that it was licensed premises. He said did not admit anybody wearing football colours or flags, and reserved the right to do so. However, his claim that licensed premises were acting because of some kind of law that stated they weren't permitted to allow anybody in wearing football colours or carrying flags of any kind forgets two important things. One is that there is no law at all in any town in Scotland which states that licensed premises must bar people who are wearing either football colours or carrying national flags or wearing any garment with national flags on it. Otherwise, t-shirts with Union Jacks on them would mean that people would be barred from chip shops. And the second thing that he forgets is that it has been decided in court, actually, that anybody who is carrying a flag and who is carrying that flag because they believe in independence is doing so because they're expressing a philosophical viewpoint. And that is not either a political action, nor is it sectarian, nor is it in any way a violent or what should we say, or aggressive attitude to have. You don't need to be barred from a chip shop just simply because you're wrapped in the flag of your country. Otherwise, visiting football supporters from all over the world would be barred from every chip shop in Scotland. So the owner of this Oban chippy has really made himself into a bit of a laughingstock when an 80-plus-year-old grandmother comes into the chip shop out of the rain. She didn't even come in to buy anything, just to shelter from the rain, only to be papped out by this heartless, ignorant person for fear of not wanting trouble. I mean, what did he expect an 80-plus-year-old woman to do? Is she going to start to kick off inside his chip shop and nut him? I mean, what is she going to do? Is she going to glass the people waiting in the queue? I mean, it beggars belief. It's a ridiculous attitude to take to anybody. Now, it set off a whole Twitter storm and a whole Facebook storm of people wanting to boycott the chip shop. Now, I have an opinion about boycotts, which is that they're not a very effective way to make a point. All they really do is drive businesses either out of business or they damage those businesses unnecessarily. And remember, the chip shop owner's attitude may not be the same as all of the people who work for him. So a boycott on a chip shop in a local town like Oban would be massive overkill. I mean, a boycott is a very blunt instrument. It tends to hurt a lot of people. Not such a bad thing if you're boycotting something like a really big mega store which can afford to take the hit, but a small business, probably not such a great idea. But anyway, this guy in the chip shop in Oban has been well exposed in the press recently. People are calling him a unionist. I think, well, even if he isn't a unionist, his attitude is ridiculous. To be afraid of an old lady wrapped in a flag who came in out of the rain is just patently absurd. And it's just an excuse, really, to pap this old woman out into the cold and the rain because he doesn't like the Scottish flag for some bizarre reason in his chip shop. Frankly, if I was in Oban and I ran a chip shop, I would be displaying the saltire proudly in the shop as being a Scottish business selling Scottish produce caught from Scottish fishing boats and served to everybody, and not shutting old ladies out because they're wearing saltires wrapped around themselves. Now, the next item on the agenda today is the BBC's bizarre coverage of the, what would you call it, the sort of pageant. It's not even a beauty pageant, it's more like an ugly pageant for Prime Minister. Who is going to be Britain's next top Prime Minister? I mean, it's a ridiculous pantomime. We have the unedifying spectacle of a whole bunch of men in suits sitting on what look like bar stools. And I said to my missus the other night as we were watching this, they look like the three wise monkeys, you know, see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil, perched on those stools. Except there was 5 of them, obviously. And Rory Stewart at the end looked like he was sick of the whole thing. He really just wanted to walk off the set. He looked like he was in a gigantic huff. Interestingly, and possibly this was deliberate, he was the only politician with both feet on the ground when he was sat in the bar stool and giving his answers. Now, maybe that was a symbolic action by Rory, saying, I'm the only person who's actually connected to reality here. But even so, Rory's ratings went down after last night. The strange thing about it is that we all know it doesn't really matter who wins. It doesn't really matter what order people are voted off in, that the end result will be Boris Johnson, because he is the runaway favourite. He's got, what was it, over 114 votes on the first ballot. Now he's going to get more than that. It's now been 2 ballots, there's another one today, so I anticipate another person being papped off the wall, as it were. And eventually there'll be none left. I mean, it's like 10 green bottles sitting on the wall, and eventually there'll be none left except Boris, and Boris will be put through with some stalking horse candidate, and it might be Jeremy Hunt, the man I always think looks like a rabbit in car headlights. The way he peers at people with his eyes wide open always gives me the impression of a scared rabbit standing in the road in a car headlights. But anyway, Hunt looks, I think, like possibly he might go forward. Maybe Gove, but who knows? And who cares, frankly? It's not going to make any difference to the outcome of what happens with Brexit, because none of them can negotiate anything at all, and they all know it, judging by the waffle that came out of their mouth. Boris Johnson wouldn't even commit to taking us out of the EU on the 31st of October. He wouldn't even, he just sort of said it was a jolly good idea, that it was feasible. But typical Boris, wriggled and squirmed and wouldn't answer the question straight. And it's obvious, very obvious to anybody watching all of these men, that they all had pathetic little selling points that they wanted to make. Sajid Javid saying, will you all back some kind of internal investigation into Islamophobia within the Tory party? Well, a bit late, Sajid, because you've already been snubbed by the President of the United States. I think it's a bit late to start worrying about Islamophobia now, after you have been thoroughly ignored and passed over in favour of the white middle class people. So the whole thing, gigantic play acting. At the end of this process, by about the middle of July, we'll have Prime Minister Boris Johnson. And what happens after that is anybody's guess. My guess at the moment is it will be Boris Johnson and probably Philip Hammond as Chancellor, because Philip Hammond is seen widely by the old age pensioners of the Tory party as a more safe pair of hands. He might keep Boris in check. Some people actually like Michael Gove, although I can't understand for the life of me why, with his strangled, phony English accent and his bizarre attitudes to everything, virtually. He seems to be a man from Scotland who hates Scotland more than anybody else in Scotland. Very strange bloke indeed. So, whatever happens with this, it makes no difference to the outcome. Brexit's going to happen, and the only outcomes now for Brexit are, I think, either a no-deal Brexit, which is the only thing that's possible now because there is no time to negotiate anything else, and the European Union will not open negotiations regardless of the change of Tory leader. So it's either going to be a no-deal Brexit, which is a huge catastrophe for the entire United Kingdom, all four nations will be badly hit by this, Scotland worst of all probably, or we end up with no Brexit at all, because what could happen is when Boris Johnson tries to force through this no deal and says, well, we can't get another deal, so we have to go for a no deal and just let it happen, Parliament is going to say, well, we voted that we wouldn't accept a no deal Brexit. So then they're in a situation where the only thing that they won't accept is the only thing that they can actually have, which means that they then have a humongous crisis and we're back to square one. Boris Johnson's probably going to have to go back to the country in another general election to try and produce a majority in favour of him and his policy of no deal Brexit. At that point, we end up with the SNP, the Scottish party, fighting that referendum, fighting that election on a single mandate to either have another referendum or just to simply declare independence. Personally, I think having an election based on asking for a referendum is again just holding the begging bowl out to Boris Johnson and saying, please give us a Section 30 order. Why not just take it? Why not just say, if we win this general election and we get more than 30 pro-independence MPs, then we will start negotiations to separate from the UK and to rejoin the European Union at the point where the UK separates from the EU. All of this, who knows when it's all going to happen, but one thing's for certain, doesn't matter who is in charge of the Tory party, the crisis is always waiting for them in the future. It's a little bit like Doctor Who. Do you remember in Doctor Who they would have a single point in time that could never be altered, one crucial event that was unavoidable, and it didn't matter how they tried to adjust the timelines, it always ended up at that point. Well, this is that point. This is the nexus of all the stupidity and all the possible futures that the Tories could have created for the country, but because of all their red lines have forced us down this channel into this funnel of no deal Brexit. And that no deal Brexit will produce one result, and that is England will Brexit by itself, because Scotland is not going to go, Northern Ireland is not going to go. We're not even sure whether Wales will go at the moment, because the Welsh are beginning to wake up and realise what a stupid idea Brexit is, and the fact that they could be independent too, especially if Northern Ireland and Scotland go. They could form part of a sort of triple alliance that would help Wales with the transition from being fully dependent on table scraps from Westminster to being fully independent and supporting themselves. Now, added on to all of this is the problem of Donald Trump, and he's going for, he started his campaign, believe it or not, already for a second term as President of the United States, even though it's a year to go before the American presidential elections take place. In the middle of all of that, Donald Trump, as you know, has been sounding warning bells that nobody should buy Huawei, Chinese, in other words, 5G equipment, and should not allow it into their countries and should not allow it to be part of their internet infrastructure. Which is a bit strange because, for one thing, the UK has already accepted Huawei hardware into its 5G network, and that can't be changed now because contracts are signed, as far as I understand it. And also the UK has bought hardware, electronic hardware, and possibly software, I'm not sure about that, but definitely hardware from Huawei, which has been put into the UK version of the American F-35 fighters. Now remember, the F-35 fighters, although these planes are mostly built in the USA, they're fitted out with UK equipment. Although the plane itself is built by the United States, the actual internal, what should we say, electronics of these aircraft, in other words, the weapons systems, the radars, things like that, are all built here in the UK. And the UK sources a lot of its components from Huawei because they make the best components. So the United Kingdom is quite happy to put Huawei technology in its most secret top fighter planes. And it's also quite happy to put Huawei hardware at the centre of its 5G network. The UK doesn't see any security risk in doing so, and according to GCHQ, they're already well prepared for any possibility of spyware or malware creeping into the Huawei system. So why is Trump making all this noise about Huawei? Why has he shut them out of America, and why has he imposed these punitive trade taxes on Chinese imports? The answer is simple. He is about to start negotiating with the Chinese government a new trade deal between China and the USA. And America, particularly Trump himself, Trump's MO for dealing with these things as a businessman is to weaken the opposite party as much as possible before he begins any kind of negotiations. He wants to put that other company at the biggest disadvantage he can. He wants the other party to be on the floor with his heel on the neck of the other party so that he can drive the most aggressive bargain he can. That's how he operates in business. He's quite proud of that fact. The Chinese, on the other hand, are, well, inscrutable is a word that's often used about the Chinese, but the Chinese do not show their hand. They're great poker players, terrific gamblers. And Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, has basically said that everybody should just grow up and be a bit sensible about these trade deals and stop taking punitive measures against China when they're about to do a trade deal with them. So what will happen? Well, the Chinese and the Americans are going to have to find some common ground because they're two massive trading blocs, probably the two largest in the world, really. China's actually a lot larger than the United States and is potentially now richer than the United States. So all of this is posturing prior to some trade deal. And in the middle of all of that, the money markets and the international global capitalism system and the free market is in turmoil because the central banks of every major country, and I think the central banks number about 6, maybe slightly more in the world, and these central banks control the value and the amounts of currency from their particular country or trading bloc. And they, at the moment, don't know what to do in order to steer their massive economies into the future. And they don't know what to do because they have run out of places to grow. There isn't enough value left in the whole economic system on the planet for any further growth. So they're in a crisis, and these massive global banks don't know what to do, how far to raise interest rates, for example. But it's thought now that interest rates are going to have to climb because the banks are not making profits because their interest rates are so low. They're having to lend trillions of dollars and make more and more and more money. In other words, print more and more money to try and keep the global economy flowing. But at the same time as printing all this money, the money is worth less and less and less, and it buys less, and that means inflation starts to go up. And the only method for controlling inflation is generally accepted to be interest rate rises. So we're probably on the brink of a global interest rate rise across the board by all of these central banks, including the ECB, the European Central Bank, the Federal Reserve of the United States, the Chinese Central Bank. Goodness knows how many other central banks there are. There's probably one in India. I'm not sure about all of these things. But all across the world, these banks are going to have to do the same things. The dollar, incidentally, is trading against the pound at its lowest ever level, $1.25 to the pound. That's the lowest the pound has been ever, as far as I'm aware. Certainly in the last 3 years, it's at an all-time low. If Brexit is a catastrophe, you can see that nosedive even further. The pound is heading down towards being almost on parity with the euro. In other words, the euro is gaining value, the pound's losing it. This is what happens when you start to isolate yourself from the trading bloc that you're a member of. Globally at the moment, it's a very mixed picture, and nobody really knows for certain what's going to happen. But one thing is for certain, global warming continues to happen, and we've seen that in the southeast of England in the last 24 hours. Over 1,000 lightning strikes. In fact, I think it was 10,000 lightning strikes in a single hour in the southeast of England in the last 24 hours. Now that's a phenomenally ferocious electrical storm. And that only happens when there's a gigantic amount of heat in the atmosphere. Reports coming out yesterday showed that there is a massive heat wave happening over the North Pole at the moment that nobody seems to be covering. But the sea ice is melting almost completely. Pictures have been shown of a polar exploration team going to recover some instruments, and they're on a dog sled, and the dogs are pulling this sleigh across the sea ice through about 6 inches of blue water. That means that the sea ice is melting from the top down, not from below, which shows just how much energy is getting to the surface in the North Pole at the moment. The sea ice is melting faster and much earlier than ever before, and trillions of cubic meters of solid ice are moving from the land on Greenland. The whole Greenland ice sheet is melting and sliding into the ocean, and that does nothing else but raise sea levels. It temporarily lowers the sea temperature, but most of the heat from this global warming that we're experiencing is going into the oceans at the moment. The ocean is a massive heat sink. It controls and disperses heat across the planet, but it also drives the weather. And the weather that we're getting at the moment, these huge heat blooms coming up off the north of Africa and also off the Balkans at the moment, are very unusual and incredibly intense. And this seems to be a pattern. Farmers interviewed this morning on the BBC said that last year, when they had, you remember, the beast from the east, had the coldest winter they've had for decades, followed by the hottest summer. It ruined crops. Crops were a fifth of the size they should have been last year. This year, everything's being washed out by torrential rain and flooding. So they're going from one extreme to the other. Farming in this country has relied on the weather patterns remaining relatively stable over centuries. Now they're becoming unstable. They don't know what to do. But one farmer said this morning that he acknowledged that climate change was going to affect the way that the UK farmers could produce enough food for us to survive on our own. And what he meant was, outside of the European Union, to be self-sufficient in food might not be possible given the instability of the weather at the moment. So a lot of things going on in the world at the moment. I've tried to kind of bring them all together, but the thing at the moment is we've got useless politicians who are basically fiddling while the country burns. We've got a Brexit coming, and it's either going to be a colossal disaster or it's going to be another colossal crisis leading to yet another election, which will eventually, I hope, lead to Scotland leaving the UK and getting out of this mess and being able to pursue a more sensible path. All of that alongside the prospect of Trump having another 5 years to wreck the global economy, to wreck the global climate with his ridiculous climate denials and America's continued burning of fossil fuels well into the rest of this century. It's not a good picture that we're seeing at the moment. And if Scotland manages to get out of this pickle with the UK, then it has to face up to a lot of other problems, and it can't do that unless we are independent of Westminster, using all of our own resources, including our oil wealth and our other natural resources, to support ourselves, and also to change the way we grow food, because that's going to have to change as well. Everything will have to change, and nothing can change while the Tories are in charge of the United Kingdom. I'll see you later. Bye bye.